Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dominic Headley, and I'm a legal officer for Nacro's Resettlement Advice Service. Part of my role involves providing operational support to employers and organisations in managing criminal record information, as well as providing training and strategic support in safer recruitment, assessing and managing risks surrounding criminal record issues for applicants, but also existing members of staff. For this part of this session on how to respond to disclosure of convictions, I'm going to be focusing mainly on some of the key systems and processes that employers can use to assess the risk of relevance of criminal records, deciding whether to hire or maybe not to hire. And I thought it would be very helpful to actually use a case study to illustrate some of the points that I'm going to be making during the session. The case study of the chap that I'm going to be focusing on is a young chap by the name of Joe the plumber. Joe is raising a young family. He has a mortgage, he has car payments, he's a very skilled employee as far as his previous employer is concerned. He's got absolutely excellent references. He's got all the qualifications that are required to be a plumber, and he's been working for a local employer for 3 years. Joe would be looking at the moment to be applying for a large national employer, but he faces a potential massive hurdle in that he's got a criminal record. And as we can see on the slide, he's got a criminal record that has various offences that on first sight might present an employer with some concern. He's got offences for burglary with intent to commit criminal damage, offences for drug possession, arson, possession of an offensive weapon. He served a 12-month sentence for assault nearly 10 years ago, and he got a speeding offence nearly 5 years ago. As a result of the changes to the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act that came in March this year, his convictions will all be considered spent on the 3rd of September, 3 months from today. But as it stands at the moment, Joe would have to be making a disclosure about all of the information that is contained on that slide. Now, as I mentioned initially, a big part of my role is actually providing support to employers. And many times I will get a call from an employer saying, I've got an applicant that's applied with a criminal record and I don't know if I can take him or not. What should I do? And my first response would be, well, has the applicant actually disclosed? It's a very key question that I need to iron out, and if that person hasn't disclosed, why not? Now, you'll notice on this slide that I've highlighted this part in green, and the reason why I've highlighted this part is because by banning the box, if an employer is addressing all of what we would want them to do with banning the box and implementing the systems and processes that come with moving disclosure to a later part of the process, both the applicant and the employer are fully braced for positive disclosure. And what that means is, in terms of the applicant, he would be signposted to all of the guidance in terms of how to work out whether his conviction is spent. He would also be signposted to the guidance produced by Unlock or Nacro in terms of how to disclose positively for an employer. And the employer would be set up to receive this positive disclosure. So we would hope that by implementing this process of banning the box, we would kind of eradicate or lower the potential for non-disclosures to occur, which is quite a massive problem that employers face. I would also say that disclosure legislation is very important. In Joe's case, his role is actually covered by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. Although he's applying for a position as a plumber and he does visit people's houses, his role is actually covered by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. He shouldn't have to be doing a DBS check for going into people's houses. He's not actually babysitting their children, but I hope not. I hope that's not part of the role as being a plumber. And also, he should not be having to bathe the vulnerable grandma that's in the house as part of his role of a plumber. But many organisations, we are aware, do carry out DBS checks for tradesman roles going into people's houses. From the tradesman's aspects, he would, if he came to me for advice, be told you don't need to disclose it. So there's a potential non-disclosure issue there if the wrong level of check was carried out. So by banning the box, both employer and applicant know specifically what questions to ask for the different type of roles. It's very, very critically important. And it's very important also that an employer should be getting disclosure information that actually informs their risk assessment process. You'll notice on the initial slide in regards to Joe, we had offences such as arson, we had offences such as burglary with intent to commit criminal damage. However, without getting the context behind that conviction, the employer is not going to be fully informed. Scott covered earlier that Interserve have a robust, safe recruitment process in place. Many employers actually do, but for some reason, following the basics of risk assessment is something that kind of gets lost in translation for many employers. It's very important that if an individual fulfills all aspects of the recruitment process, like Howard covered, got the right skills, the right qualifications, the right abilities, experience, and very critically references, that we don't throw all of that in the bin when there's a declaration of a criminal record. And very importantly, it's always important to document your decisions and rationale, regardless of whether you're hiring or not hiring. Some of the key factors that you may wish to consider: applying a balanced, or as we say, a common sense and rational approach to disclosure when you receive it. The objective for the employer, we would hope, is not to further punish applicants for their past mistakes, but to actually assess whether or not the individual poses a real risk of harm in the role that's applied for within your organisations. And what we mean by real risk of harm is, do we genuinely believe that by Joe's offences for burglary with intent to commit criminal damage, that he would cause a risk of doing the same whilst he's employed by us? So rather, real risk rather than perceived risk. A lot of times people's in organisations concerned or influenced very much so by media coverage, for example. Another thing I would ask an employer to look at is to look at your own organisation's experience of employing people with convictions. Howard mentioned earlier he's had a very, very positive experience. When you're looking at a risk, when you're considering an application from an individual with a criminal record, try to think in your mind, have we really had a problem? Have we had loads of people that have applied to our organisation, we've given them a chance, and because of them having a criminal record, they've let us down? If they haven't, then why are we making it a problem? Just bringing it back to real risk rather than perceived risk again. And another important point is to treat applicants on a case-by-case basis rather than stereotyping or generalising. Somebody could have had a conviction for shoplifting, but does that mean that because one person had a conviction for shoplifting, that everybody who's got a conviction for shoplifting could present a risk in your organisation? I like to say to employers to challenge the automatic picture that's built up in your mind when presented by an applicant's criminal record or the offence code. For some reason, it's very common that when a disclosure might be made by an applicant, they've built up a rapport with the hiring manager, but when seeing it in black and white on a criminal record certificate later on, and you see the offence code battery, all of a sudden there's a picture built up in an employer's mind that sort of leads to them thinking that they're more of a risk. Yeah. Right, assessing risk considering the criminal record. I'll whiz through some of this part because many of you employers would have seen these principles of risk assessment already. Many of you will actually have them in your recruitment process as well. The key parts that I would focus on looking at these principles of assessing risk is the circumstances behind the offences. And what I mean by that is circumstances at the time that the individual committed the offences and comparing those circumstances to the individual today. In Joe's case, when he committed the burglary, is his life the same now as when he committed those offences many years ago? And we'll cover that in a little while on some of the slides I've got in a bit. And is his attitude the same to the offences as his attitude is now? Change in circumstances and responsibilities taken on. As we saw earlier in the case study of Joe, he's got a family now, he's got 2 young kids, he's got a mortgage, he's got commitments. Really and truly, he's got a lot to lose if he was to go back and commit offences like he did in the past. On this slide here, I always advise organisations when they're starting to look at putting in a system of measuring risk to look at the potential risks to the organisation as a whole. So what I mean by that is you can use a risk hazard matrix, which is very similar to a health and safety form, where you could bring together a number of your staff and look at all of the potential risks of harm that individuals could potentially cause in your organisation, such as fear of harassment, or people going and stealing from staff or service users, or them acting inappropriately, or if they had a sexual offence, downloading child images. So it's very handy to document all of the potential concerns that you might have for your specific organisation, and then look at what the systems you've got in place to mitigate those risks already. For example, in a warehouse, they will have sometimes CCTV cameras. So even if a person had traditionally got a conviction for theft, if you've got CCTV cameras in place, does that help you mitigate the risk? When we look at this system, relevance of conviction, we've got task. What will the person do for you? Scott's already covered that earlier on when he was talking from the Interserve side. In terms of individual, we're obviously going to get all of this information through the disclosure statement. Load and environment is again looking at what is the role that the individual is actually going to be providing for you in your organisation, and what support systems are in place. It's very important to remember that unless an individual is barred or otherwise excluded, it's completely down to the discretion of the employer as to whether or not they will take them on. We've got here on the next two slides information on how to put together a positive disclosure statement, which was covered in the last webinar by my colleague Lee Jones. So I won't go over it again because of the timescale. It's just going to be available for you after the session in order that you can look at it. How I'll end off is actually looking at some of the offences that Joe committed. You might have seen earlier that he had an offence for burglary with intent to commit criminal damage. And naturally, for a chap applying to be a plumber, that would cause an employer some concern. What were the circumstances behind his offence? Joe was homeless. He was age 16. During one particularly cold night, he searched for somewhere to sleep. He came across an old derelict disused warehouse and sought shelter for the night. A neighbour saw him entering the building and called the police. Without Joe having the opportunity to explain those circumstances, you would not, as the employer, probably know that. The arson offence. Right, while Joe was in that disused shelter, he set fire to an empty litter bin in order to keep warm during the cold winter night that he sought shelter. There was absolutely no suggestion he'd endangered anyone's life, and he received an 18-month conditional discharge order for the offence. Possession of an offensive weapon in a public place. Whilst he was training as a plumber, Joe was stopped one evening by the police in possession of a wrench. He tried to explain that he'd retrieved the wrench from a job where he'd left it behind, but he was arrested and charged. He ultimately received a conditional discharge order for possession of an offensive weapon in public. Without Joe having the opportunity to explain all of this, the automatic picture that had been built up in the employer's mind could possibly have led to him losing the job offer.